Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is World War. The year is 1917. Wilson has recently been re-elected on a theme that he kept the United States out of war, perhaps a nation that was too proud to fight, he had talked about during the campaign. But the Germans were about to change the calculus that impacted the Americans. The Germans realized, in their view, the only way to win this war before all of their own resources would be depleted was an all-out blitz, on land and on sea, and for that, a change in tactics. No longer would neutral vessels be safe in the waters around the Allies. They were going with unrestricted submarine warfare, so any ship in the area of the Allies was subject to being sunk, neutral or not. Now, they realized that this would probably bring the Americans into the war, but their strategy and their thought process was the Americans really hadn't prepared for war. It's going to take them a long time to mobilize, maybe about a year or so, and with that time, with this new strategy, maybe that was enough to get a victory for the Germans. What did this mean for Woodrow Wilson? Well, he confided to Joe Tumulty that this means war. The break that we have tried so hard to prevent now seems inevitable, but not quite yet. And one other thing factored into this. The Germans were looking for an insurance policy against the Americans, and for that, they reached out to the government of Mexico. In this case, it was the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmerman, sending a note to their ambassador in Mexico to entice the Mexicans to take up war against the United States. The goal was to bottle up U.S. troops in North America so they couldn't come over to Europe and fight against the Central Powers. What was the enticement for the Mexicans? Well, how about Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all that land that the Mexicans had lost to the United States in a war back in the 1840s? That would be theirs again if they joined on with the Germans against the United States. Now, this message was intercepted by the British. They turned it over to the Americans. They made it public. There was a big uproar about this, more calls for war against Germany. And besides, the Mexicans weren't interested. They decided to pass on this strategy anyway. All of this leading to the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson on March the 4th of 1917 to start his second term. He's sworn into office by the Chief Justice Edward White, and he gave an address in which he said, "The shadows that now lie dark upon our path will soon be dispelled, and we shall walk with the light all about us if we be true to ourselves as we have wished to be known in the councils of the world and in the thought of all those who love liberty and justice and the right exalted," beginning to prepare the Americans possibly for the inevitable. Well, that inevitability was getting really close. A cabinet meeting was held by Wilson on March the 20th, just a couple of weeks into his second term, and at this point, every single cabinet member was in favor of going to war against Germany and the Central Powers, including the last man standing, which was the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. Daniels was a close friend and colleague of William Jennings Bryan, the previous Secretary of State under Wilson, who had resigned the cabinet because he was a pacifist and did not want to go to war. Daniels was typically been aligned with Bryan, but even he, the last holdout, agreed it was time to take up arms. So Wilson got that message. He was on board as well. He went off to his study for a couple of days to craft his war message. The only one he was allowed to see that was his new wife, Edith. He talked it over with her before going to a joint session of Congress on April the 2nd, 1917, in which Wilson said to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people, the German people included, for the rights of nations great and small and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy, is what Woodrow Wilson said. The harsher his words, actually, the greater the applause lines from the members of the House and Senate and Supreme Court who were all in attendance, which case was a little bit odd for Woodrow Wilson, as he told Tumulty that night after the speech that think of what it was they were applauding. My message today was a message of death for our young men. How strange it seems to applaud that. But that was the fervor that was being created. Quick approval in the House of Representatives to this declaration of war. Senate came along right away as well. April the 6th at 1:19 p.m., Woodrow Wilson signed that declaration, and the United States was at war. Massive mobilization was to follow. The military, the civilian, the economy. Remember, the United States had not really done much preparation for war, so they had a long way to go before they could get their men into the fight. But before all of that, one of the first things that Woodrow Wilson had to deal with was somebody who came to the White House just 3 days after his speech to volunteer to raise his own regiment and move over to Europe right away before the Americans were fully mobilized. Kind of a morale boost, get some Americans into the fight. But this person volunteering wasn't just any ordinary American. It happened to be Theodore Roosevelt, the former president who had been excoriating Woodrow Wilson for the last several months for not getting into the war. And Roosevelt, in his opening line to Wilson, tried to brush that all aside. He said, "Mr. President, what I have said and thought and what others have said and thought is all dust in a windy street. Just forget all that nonsense of those months and months." And he went on and had a pretty pleasant conversation with Wilson. They talked about this strategy that Roosevelt had, and he told Roosevelt when he left the White House, basically he would think about it. But in the end, this was a non-starter for Woodrow Wilson. He did agree that when he said to Tumulty, yes, he is a great big boy. I was as formerly charmed by his personality. There's a sweetness about him that is very compelling. You can't resist the man. I can easily understand why his followers are so fond of him, but this was not a good idea for Woodrow Wilson to have sort of a rogue unit going off into the war. Wilson wanted to recruit in a very systemic process by a draft. That's how he was going to stock the American military. Plus the politics of this. There's just no upside for Wilson to have a Theodore Roosevelt tramping around Europe. And so he said no to Roosevelt, was bitter over it. That brief moment where he was trying to be Wilson's friend, that was gone for good. But Wilson, frankly, had more important things on his mind with this thing pushed aside. The military for the United States, a standing military, had always been relatively small, and then it would scale up for wars and scale back down again. So in this case, the Americans needed men for that military. They needed millions, and this was going to be the first draft since the Civil War for the United States. 10 million people ages 21 to 30, that was the initial group. They registered for the draft. That would later be expanded to 18 to 45-year-old males. 2.7 million Americans would be drafted into the military, or about 4 million total that would serve in the war. About 2.7 came from the draft. About 2 million would actually go to Europe, and about half that would actually fight on the battle lines. But in the meantime, it was mobilization, building camps, training. This was going to take months. One of the key decisions, of course, in any military operation is who was going to be the leader. And for a long time, it was felt that if the Americans got into the war, General Frederick Funston was the most likely to lead them into theater. But he had recently died of a heart attack. So where was Wilson going to go? How about Leonard Wood, another decorated general? Potentially to lead the men, but he was really close to Theodore Roosevelt, so Wilson put aside Wood. He ended up with John Pershing, the man he had recently sent into Mexico to chase Ponce Villa. He is now going to be in charge of the American Expeditionary Force going into theater. Now President Wilson, the commander-in-chief of the military, he had no military experience, and he kind of knew that, and he really let the military leaders lead throughout both the mobilization and in battle. But he had one standing order that he was insisting upon. No American soldier was going to be simply a replacement into a British or a French unit. The Americans would go in when they're ready to fight as American units under American flags. According to Wilson, to Secretary of War Newton Baker, nothing except sudden and manifest emergency be suffered to interfere with the building up of a great distinct American force at the front, acting under its own flag and its own officers. What about financing the war? This was, of course, going to be an expensive proposition, and Woodrow Wilson really wanted the current generation to pay for as much of this as possible, and that would be done through tax increases. But only about a third of the war could be covered from taxes, and the rest had to be done by borrowing, and for that, Liberty bonds was the mechanism that were being sold. Congress approving the largest bond sale in American history, initially at $7 billion. These could be as little as $50 a pop. And it was oversubscribed in about a month. Almost all Americans trying to do their part, whether they could afford $50 or more, lend the government that money at a little bit of an interest rate that they were eventually going to get paid back. That covered about 2/3 of the war. You can see the debt for the United States in 1917 was about $2 billion. 1918, $14 billion. 1919, it was up to $19 billion because the Americans were not going to let costs get in the way of winning this war. They also had to get people in charge. And for that, the Woodrow Wilson called on the business community. And in this case, it was both Democrats and Republicans, the best people he could find to do execution. And what their job was, cut that red tape, get the bureaucracy out of the way, get results, and get it fast. So some of these players, Bernard Baruch became the chair of the War Industries Board. Herbert Hoover, who had been a volunteer helping the Belgians, trying to feed them during the early part of the war, Wilson was impressed. He made him the new chair of the Food Administration. And Hoover pronounced looking for sacrifice on behalf of the American people to get that food over where it was needed in Europe. So he introduced meatless Tuesdays in the United States, wheatless Wednesdays. The American people responded to this, very much a patriotic call, sacrifice, embracing it, including the Wilsons in the White House. They brought a flock of sheep to the White House so they wouldn't have to pay for cutting the grass. They eventually took the wool from that sheep, sold it to raise money for the war, everybody trying to do their part. Others involved, again, including Republicans like William Taft, the former president. He became the chair of the War Labor Board. He took a leave of absence from his teaching position at Yale, trying to avoid work stoppages that could be harmful to the war effort. Dr. Harry Garfield, the son of the former president, became in charge of the Fuel Administration, and even Charles Evans Hughes, who had recently run against Wilson for the presidency, he was asked to lead an investigation for potential corruption at the Aircraft Board. Everybody, all hands on deck. Now, another piece of the war effort was propaganda, winning the hearts and minds of the American people. And for that, Wilson established the Committee of Public Information, the CPI, under a reporter by the name of George Creel. Creel would rally the citizenry through emotion, through patriotism, the themes of unity, sacrifice, and service. All of this, really with the most effective propagandist, was Woodrow Wilson himself. He was giving patriotic speeches, including one on Flag Day, in which he said, "For us, there is but one choice. We have made it. Woe be to the man or group of men that seeks to stand in our way in this day of high resolution, when every principle we hold dearest is to be vindicated and made secure for the salvation of the nations. We are ready to plead at the bar of history, and our flag shall wear a new luster. Once more we shall make good with our lives and fortunes the great faith to which we were born, and a new glory shall shine in the face of our people," said Woodrow Wilson. Now, not all speech in the United States at this time was in favor of the war. There was some people who were objecting, but that was not going to be tolerated. And first, Congress passed an Espionage Act, which initially included a sedition clause, censoring the press, anything that would be said sort of against the government. Now, this was controversial, including, if you think about it, in the mind of Woodrow Wilson, if you go back to history. At a time for a couple of decades before, when he was a president, he talked about America's first Sedition Act, which took place in 1798 under the administration of John Adams during the quasi-war with France. And Wilson initially, when he was a professor, said that this cut perilously near the root of freedom of speech and of the press. There was no telling where such exercises of power would stop. Their only limitations and safeguards lay in the temper and good sense of the president and the attorney general. That was a cautionary note, but now, of course, he was the president in a different situation, and he was actually pushing for this Espionage Act to include the sedition clause. Well, Congress debated this piece of it pretty carefully and eventually said no to the sedition clause, but for now. Later on in the war period, they actually would pass it. This would be yet another war in which the First Amendment lost out to national security, not at the beginning, but eventually, and Woodrow Wilson was now a supporter of suppressing that dissenting speech as part of the war effort. Woodrow Wilson was bringing the full national power into this fight. His goal was clear: to make this the war to end all wars, because he was already starting about post-war agreements, how to win the peace, and how the United States would lead in that. But those are stories for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson and World War from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.